Well, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 39 of the Secunda Secundae of St. Thomas Aquinas. We are looking at the topic of schism, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are still looking at the vices against charity, right? So the theological virtue of charity. And of these vices contrary to charity, some of them are contrary to joy, right? So sloth and envy. And some of them are contrary to peace. And those are the ones we are dealing with now. So schism is a vice against peace, right? What happens when you have schism? Well, you don't have peace, right? These green ones over here are all contrary to peace. Okay, so this one's a little bit longer than the previous two, discord and contention. Schism is a special sin, St. Thomas points out. He says, a schismatic is one who holds the same faith and practices the same worship as others and takes pleasure in the mere disunion of the community. Right? I think probably somebody who's a schismatic would not agree that they are taking pleasure in the disunity of the community, but they would agree that they hold the same faith and practice the same worship. Right? They probably would agree to that. Now, a heretic, in contrast, is one who holds another faith from that of the Catholic Church. Right? So heretics hold a different faith. Schismatics hold the same faith, but they just do it separate, right? There's a separation between their community and the communion. St. Thomas points out that a schismatic intends to sever himself or herself from the unity which is the effect of charity, right? Because charity unites not only one person to another with the bonds of spiritual love, but also the whole church in unity of spirit. Right? I kept the whole line in there because I thought that was very beautifully written and very important. That a schismatic intends to sever himself from the unity, which is the charity, which is the effect of charity. Right? This is why this vice is associated with, right, contrary to charity. Right? Because if the whole idea is that you love God for God's own sake, you abide in God, you are in the enjoyment of God, you are friends with God for God's own sake, and then that extends into your neighbors, and you treat your neighbor as another self, right? There is a unity there, right? There's a unity that in that perfect situation, my will, my neighbor's will, and God's will are all united in the goodness of God, right? And there's peace as a result of this, right? We're all on the same page. As soon as you become schismatic, you sever that unity, right? There's the will of God, there's the will of your neighbor, there's the will of you, and you're saying, I want something else, right? My will is not the same as everyone else's will, right? Maybe this is a bit of an idealized perspective, right? With so many denominations nowadays, it's not just in and out. You've got thousands of denominations, millions of denominations. It's more complicated, but in this kind of simple Catholic view, right, it's just, well, we are all the people of God working towards the will of God, right? And if you want to break from that and do it your own way, that would be schismatic, and it would break the bonds of spiritual love. Now, right, so heresy is a violation of faith, but schismatic is a violation of unity. Right? So that's the principle that it violates, which then leads to a breakdown of peace. St. Thomas says people can be schismatic in two ways. One is that you break communion with the community, right? That there's no longer a communion there. And the other, and this is connected, is that you break from the head of the body of Christ. You break from the head of the church, the Pope, right? The Supreme Pontiff. So St. Thomas points out, now the head of Christ himself, who is the vice regent in the church. Now the head is Christ himself, right? So that who is the head of the church? Christ. Okay. Protestants might be surprised to hear that. They think it's the Pope. But St. Thomas is saying the head of the church is Christ himself. He's the head. The vice regent, right, the Secretary of State of the church is the pontiff. Secretary of State traditionally would have the keys to the kingdom, right? This makes some sense, right? The political language is what the language Jesus used to appoint Peter to run the church. He's the Secretary of State, whereas Christ is the king, right? So this makes sense in the hierarchy. The Pope is not the king. Christ is the king. Wherefore, the schismatics who are those who refuse to submit to the Supreme Pontiff and hold to the communion with her members, right? So as soon as you break from communion with the members, you are like de facto excommunicated, right? Because you are not in communion, right? So you're saying, I don't want to be part of this communion. I'm going to be part of it. I'm going to make a new communion. That's what the schismatic does. And I do not hold myself under the Pope. Well, this, when you look at that kind of political system, is contrary to some pretty important things. One is, if Christ is the king of the kingdom, and the Pope is the Secretary of State, and we are citizens in this kingdom of God, to say, I'm not going to be under the Secretary of State, who was appointed by the king to be Secretary of State, is to say, I will be part of a different nation, a different kingdom. But this kingdom has Christ as the king, right? So what kingdom are you going to create? You say, well, I'll create a new kingdom where Christ will be the king. Well, he's already the king of this kingdom, and he has appointed the Pope to be the Secretary of State, and you are a citizen in it. So to leave to be under a new kingdom, right? Because if you think of Christ as the emperor now, right, the leader of many kingdoms, I guess you could do that. But the image is Christ the King, because we are a united city of God. Right? That's part of the idea. Now, is schism worse than unbelief? Well, St. Thomas says no, it's not worse than unbelief, really, because an unbeliever again, is against the principle of faith. Right? They are contrary to faith itself, versus a schismatic who holds the faith in its entirety, but they are against unity. Right? So, which is worse, being against faith or against unity? Worse to be against faith, right? Because the direct object of faith is God. Right? The direct object of unity is the church, right? So it is better to be against the church than it is to be against God, right? It's better not to be against either of them. But if you had to say which one is worse, it is worse to be against God than it is to be against the church, right? But St. Thomas also points out that circumstances matter. So in terms of the species or the object, right, it's better to hate the church than it is to hate God. But it is, but under certain circumstances, it might be worse to be a schismatic than an unbeliever. An example would be, let's say you were secretly an unbeliever. Well, then it only affects your own soul. If you were publicly a schismatic and you are the leader of a schismatic movement, now you may have led hundreds or thousands or millions of other people into schism. It would have been better if you were just an unbeliever and you just mind your own business, drank your coffee, and read your books, right? It would be better if you just were an unbeliever in the privacy of your house than it would be to have brought all these other people into schism. Now, do schismatics retain their spiritual authority? Do they continue to have spiritual power? Right? It's a kind of a term. Now, this is an interesting argument. So, St. Thomas points out, man acts as God's instrument, so that sacramental effects are not precluded on the account of any fault whatever in the person who confers the sacrament. Right? This is This is against Donatism. Donatism says the sins of the clergy nullify the sacraments, but St. Thomas says whether the pipe is made of lead or if it's made of gold, both get the water equally there. Right? Maybe we wouldn't want to say lead today because we know it poisons the water, but we could say whether the pipe is made of clay or the pipe is made of gold, the water, which is the grace of God. So it doesn't matter whether the pipe brings the water, whether it's made of gold or made of clay, the water is grace, so that works just the same. So it's nice to have gold pipes, but if you have clay pipes, you still have the grace. You still have the water. That's all that matters. But St. Thomas points out they neither absolve nor excommunicate nor grant indulgences nor anything of any kind, and if they do, it is invalid. So some points here about the authority of schismatics. So one issue is of being, right? Are they still ordained? This idea that if you were ordained a priest or bishop, do you retain it when you become a schismatic? And because of Donatism, the answer is yes. Yeah, you retain the ability to, you retain the power of the priesthood. Now, what you don't have is jurisdiction, right? You don't have jurisdiction, so you can't exercise your power. If it were a case of an emergency, maybe, right? You could, in case of baptism, you could. But there's some things where you don't have the proper exercise of authority and that is primarily the ability to absolve sins, right? So confession. Right? So a schismatic priest can confect the Eucharist unlawfully, right? Illicitly. They could anoint the sick illicitly, right? But they can't absolve sins, right? The only one who can absolve sins is the bishop, and whoever the bishop gives that jurisdiction to. Now, there are people like in the Society of Pius X, the Pope, I think it was in 2017 or so. It was in the, not that long ago, but the Pope extended the rights for, I believe, people like Society of Pius X to absolve sins. Right. There are, I think, some rules where they say, this is very debated, I think, but if you were a lay faithful and you did not know that the priest was Pius X, Society of Pius X, and you didn't know that they were schismatic, and you didn't know they didn't have authority, then if you went to that priest for confession, the church has granted the authority for that confession to absolve sins, right? And it's not for the sake of the priest, it's for the sake of the lay faithful who didn't know any better. Now, if you are a member of the Pius X Society, you went to a Pius X Society Mass, this was your home parish, then you know, right? So then you may not be able to, because the church doesn't want to show indifference towards schism, right? It confers with it excommunication, right? So it comes with a penalty. However, we don't want to hurt innocent people who see a priest and say, "Oh, Father, can you hear my confession?" And you think he's a Roman Catholic priest in good standing, and he turns out he's a schismatic. It's not to bind the sins of the penitent, right? It's not the goal. Others, like Pius X, it was, because we're in a negotiation with the society, that some bishops could allow weddings to take place in their diocese if performed by Pius X. They can exercise jurisdiction to do that. up to the local bishop, right? This is something that's a moving target. It's changing, but it's saying that there are some, if a priest becomes schismatic and then he comes back, he doesn't have to be reordained. It's up to the bishop whether they'll let him come back and exercise jurisdiction, exercise ministry in that diocese, but the person wouldn't have to be reordained, reconsecrated. This is kind of an earlier church issue, right, back to Donatism. But it makes the distinction between valid and licit, right? So valid sacraments, but unlawful to exercise that jurisdiction, right? But some things would just be a matter of validity too, right? Anything that's dealing with absolving, excommunicating, or granting indulgences, they have just no authority, right? Okay, what type of punishment it should be on schismatics? Well, there's twofold. One is the breach of communion, right? The first, back to Article 1, it violates communion. You say, well, I don't want to be part of this community. I'm going to start a new community, right? So you are violating that communion, therefore you are excommunicated, right? It's kind of logical. The second one is your failure to submit to the head of the church, right? The Supreme Pontiff, the Pope, which then could lead to secular or temporal punishments. That could be possible. Now, this is more true of the time that St. Thomas Aquinas was writing with an inquisition, right? The state could say, well, if you don't submit to the church, you could have a trial. There could be temporal consequences, right? You could be thrown in jail. You could be burned at the stake, even, right? If it was for the good of the whole, right? This could be true because you failed to submit to the authority of the head of the church, right? So this is a punishment for schismatics as well. Now the purpose, and St. Thomas points this out in the responses, the purpose of this is to get people back communicated. The point is to put pressure on them so that they come back. That's the goal. The goal isn't to be burning people at the stake. It's to be returning people to full communion. That's the goal. And if one versus another punishment works, then leave it at that, right? So if excommunication brings them back, well, then don't throw them in jail in addition, right? The point is to get them back. If they come back, then you drop it, right? Don't continue on. This is not punitive. It's not. It's reparative, right? It's the goal to bring somebody back to full health. So in conclusion, schism is a special type of sin against unity, which is a violation of peace, contrary to charity. Unbelief is worse than schism, right? Because it's against faith itself, not against unity. It's against God itself, not against the church. The power of schismatics, some of it retains, right? Although it becomes unlawful. And then the punishment of the schismatic is excommunication, or depending on your country, it could have secular punishments as well. So that is it for schismatics.